The movement is determined by depending on the units that depending on the unit or units that a player decides to activate, and depends of course on the kind of units, and depends whether it is a confederate or a union unit. So the player must roll one or two dice in order to determine the movement allowance for that unit. Now the game comes with a table here. This is the Confederate force display, which at the bottom has the turn record track and the movement track. So if the player decides to activate one single unit, if it is an infantry unit, it rolls only one die. If the unit is a Confederate unit, the player adds one. If it is a Union unit, the player only rolls the die, and the result is its movement allowance. So let's say that the Union player has the initiative. What the player decides to activate these infantry units here. So what the player does is to roll one die. Let's say that the roll comes out 5. Okay. Then the player puts this counter, active movement allowance, on 5 to keep track of the movement. In the moment the unit is activated, let's say that this unit has a manpower of 12. Okay. In the moment, and this unit has never been activated before, in the moment this unit is activated, it gains 1 fatigue level, and it decides to move of many axes as I mean, it decides to move as much as it wants, of course, following some rules which I'll show in a moment. A unit is given also the option of performing a forced march. So let's say, for example, that this unit is a fatigue level 1, but the unit needs to move more axes. So in this case, being an infantry unit, what the player does is to roll again one die and to subtract 1 if the unit is an infantry. So a unit is given the possibility of extending its movement allowance by performing what is called a forced march. So what the player does in the moment that decides to perform a forced march, if his strength marker is on its organized side, it is flipped on its disorganized side, then the player rolls a die, only 1 if it is infantry and 2 in case it is a cavalry, and subtract 1. So let's say that the player rolls 4, he subtracts 1, and this means that the player gets a total of 1, 2, 3 more movement points. However, after performing, after using these 3 more movement points, the strength marker is replaced with a marker with a manpower value of 1 less. So in this case, from 12, the player will be assigned, these units will be given a manpower counter of 11. Okay? So instead of activating only 1 unit, the player can decide to activate several units by activating a leader. So every leader has a command range of 3 axes. Okay? There are some limitations on where these three axes can extend. How does the leader activation work? The player again roll one die. There are some modifiers. For example, in this case, let's say that we activate Longstreet. Longstreet is giving a bonus of 2. So in the moment that you decide to activate Longstreet with the unit stacked in his hex, and with the units belonging, of course, to the same corp in the range of 3 axes, you place the corpse activation marker. You roll one die. You add, for example, in this case, 2, and let's say that the Confederate rolls, I don't know, 4. You add 2 and you get a total of 6. And then you move each unit singularly, keeping track of every single unit movement with this other marker. Why is the movement allowance very important? Because according to how many movement points you get, you can perform or not certain kind of attacks. Here is a table that shows this. This is basically how combat works. Once you activate a unit, and a unit can march and then perform an attack. Now, what is relevant is that attacking has a certain cost a certain number of movement points. So, and according to how many of these movement points you spend, you get either a negative or a positive modifier on your die roll. So sometimes the forced march is very important in order to gain enough points to march and reach a certain unit and then perform an attack. There are, of course, movement restrictions. It is very important to try to follow the roads as much as possible, because moving from a clear X to a rolling or to a rough X may cause several points to the unit, and it is not possible to move into a mountain X unless there is a road crossing that X. So, for example, no unit can enter these 2 X's here. Creeks here do not affect movements. A unit cannot cross at any time minor or major river. Major river is this big one here, unless it isn't at fords or bridges. A unit is also, in the recovery phase of the game, is also given the opportunity of building bridges. But I won't not cover that section. How does combat work? At first it may seem a bit tricky, but once you play a few turns, you'll see that it is quite easy.